Alrighty. Are you good to go, Chris? Shall we formally kick this off?
Sure, Hazel, that sounds good.
Just ticked past 4 o'clock. Hey, so welcome everyone to the first City Futures Research Centre seminar of 2022. I'm joining you today from the unceded land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and some of my colleagues are joining us from Bidjigal land on the UNSW campus, where our lab space has just reopened today. Woohoo! I acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we're living and working, and I pay my respect to elders past and present. And people are joining us today from all over the place, so I encourage you to share in the chat which lands you're joining us from today if you would like to. So today we're going to hear from our Centre Director, Chris Pettit, and he's going to kick us off and kick off the year with some brief updates on the centre before he and Reg Wade are presenting to us on the potential value uplift of a high-speed rail network across the east coast of Australia. So we'll have a little bit of time at the end for questions, which I'll facilitate, but without any further ado, I will hand over to Chris.
Thanks, Hazel. And yeah, as you said, we've got two parts to this presentation. I'm just going to give a quick update to kick the year off. Thanks, Bala, who is our lab coordinator and the seminar series coordinator, and Ali, who run this seminar series for us. And the recordings will be on our YouTube channel, I believe, now that we're fully embracing social media. So I'm just going to recap somewhat on what's happened in 2021, the updates in the centre, very briefly, and more importantly, looking towards the future. And then I'm just going to briefly, if everyone could go on mute, would be fantastic. And then we'll look at delving into having somewhat of a deep dive for 25 minutes or so into one of our first reports for the year on high-speed rail and value uplift, where Reg Wade has been leading a lot of the analytics on that with Will Thackeray, and Reg is going to present that. So the centre, we've revisited our mission, made that abundantly clear that what we're about is conducting independent research and providing evidence-based inputs into contemporary urban policy debates and the planning of our future cities. And we also look at training the next generation, working with our planning program and others here in the School of Built Environment, UNSW, to skill them up to be able to understand how cities function, how they should function, and how we deal with some of those challenges. So we have, of course, the centre is nothing without the people, and we have our leadership team. So we had the Deputy Director, Associate Professor Hazel Easthope, who kindly opened the seminar series, Professor Hal Pawson, Professor Simon Pinniger, Professor Susan Thompson, and Associate Professor Hoon Han, part of the senior management team. And we have a number of other professors and research associates, postdocs in our centre. So over 20 full-time researchers with 12 professors, and importantly, we have over 40 Masters PhD students, the next generation of those who are going to be shaping the future of our cities. Our City Futures Fellows, this is a new program. We had a first intake of fellows last year with the likes of Professor Rob Freestone, Dr. Laura Cromlin, and others, Dr. Negan Nazarian, who are very connected into our centre and conducting a number of the projects that we undertake. We have about 42 active projects at the moment that keep us busy. So we were very fortunate to have some of our research win some awards last year. Planning Institute of Australia Award. We were fortunate to win the National Award for our Rapid Analytics Interactive Scenario Explorer. That was the Value Australia team. We also won the award for Smart Social Spaces, creating connected greater green places. Professor Susan Thompson and others in the School of Built Environment. And Negan, as Nazarian, was leading this IoT Smart Cities Award, some of the work around smart cities in Western Sydney. Timely that Hal's just come in to join us, because One of the highlights last year was Howe's research in the UK. So we do international research as well as using Sydney as a living laboratory and trying to make an impact both locally and globally. And Howe's been conducting this monitor for a number of years now. And last year it was picked up by industry magazine Inside Housing as the #1 piece of housing research in the country. So well done, Howe. Up and coming projects. So the centre has more recently been looking at a suite of active transport projects. We've always had the sort of healthy built environment portfolio led by Professor Susan Thompson, but more recently delving into really active transport around cyclability of our cities and how do we design better cities that are more active transport friendly. So Dr. Mike Harris is leading some work there on behalf of the centre, and Dr. Brian Lee is also leading some work around building a bikeability tool to help the better planning as we look at rolling out more cycling infrastructure across Sydney and our cities. And we do this, of course, in partnership with Transport for New South Wales, Penrith City Council, Wollongong, and a number of other key partners. So very pleased there's a project that Hazel, myself, and Bill Randolph have been working on in partnership, of course, the Australian Data Analytics Platform, which we launched the website last year. So working with NIFIC, Hugh Huddican and our friends at NIFIC, and also the ABS AHW, a number of universities, Oran at University of Melbourne and others, to build this platform, which the vision is to unlock housing data sets that researchers and policymakers can't get to very easily, so we can have more evidence-based decisions provided to government and industry to shape our cities and deal with the challenges of housing affordability and so forth. Part of that is colouring cities, working with colleagues at University College London and the Turing Institute in the UK, being able to take what they've got with Colouring London and set this up for Colouring Sydney, Colouring Melbourne, Adelaide, and so forth. So a very exciting infrastructure project that we have underway. If you'd like to know more about that, have a look at the website or speak to myself, Hazel, or Bill. Media hits. So the centre last year did very well media-wise. Bill topped the charts with 53 media hits. Hal wasn't far behind him, and Hazel as well. But it's very pleasing that some of the research that we undertake is picked up in the media, and the research that Reg is going to be presenting with myself today got picked up by the Australian Financial Review a couple of weeks ago. I think we had about 2 million potential views of that research. So yes, it's great when the Australian Financial Review and others pick up what we're working on, and that's what we're working towards, is research that has impact. Our facility, so this is the first time Bala's dusted off our city analytics lab. So Hal, Reg, Bala and myself are in the actual lab. It's a hybrid setup. So we've got a video wall here behind me. We've got touch screens. It was opened by Minister Fletcher a few years ago, but with COVID, it's been sort of mothballed a couple of times for obvious reasons. But really, and we're very excitingly, we're about to launch sort of an extension of the facility in the new Parramatta Innovation Hub. And we've been working on that, so stay tuned for that. But really a space to support planning, decision making, urban design. So we've also been looking at the SDGs more carefully and understanding how we can really make a difference globally, and what research we're doing across our 42 projects is addressing which SDGs. Unsurprisingly, we've got quite a bit of research looking at SDG 11, which is around sustainable communities and cities. And we have about 84% of our research looking at addressing somewhat one or more of the SDGs. If you want to know more about that, Ali's put that up on our website, and there's a URL link to that. We're also hosting, it was one international conference, but it's now a dual international conference. So 2 international conferences in one in October on campus here at Kensington. The Smart Data, Smart Cities International Conference, which is the first time it's come into the Southern Hemisphere, in conjunction with 3D Geoinfo, with our colleagues in Grid at UNSW, Professor CC Slatanova. And so this conference, there's a call for papers, so anyone who'd like to put in a paper in this conference. The abstracts are due in March. If anyone would like to sponsor or partner with us in hosting the conference, please contact myself or Ali. But we're very excited to be hosting this event, and fingers crossed, we'll have a very strong face-to-face opportunity to catch up and network and talk around what we're doing with digital twins and models to better support policy decision-making across our cities. And last year, we sort of ramped up to another level, our social media. As I mentioned before, we have our YouTube channel where all our seminar presentations are made available. We have our LinkedIn account now, which has been set up as quite active. Of course, we've had Twitter for some time, and we've got Dr. Chris Martin looking after our blog, where we have a lot of our articles going into quite some depth, providing quite a good précis for some of our reports and thought leadership. Of course, we couldn't do any of this without our partners, whether it's Australian Research Council, whether it's Ahuri, whether it's the ARDC, government departments and so forth, really make this research possible. And my clicker stopped working, so that must be the end of my presentation. No, there's more, but wait. No, maybe that's it. End of presentation. So what we'll do now, that was just a quick update. I'm sure there's no questions around that, but just sort of give you a snapshot of what we've been up to recently, City Futures, and what we're looking towards. So we might get into the more exciting part of the presentation, which is the preliminary investigation that we've done looking at the high-speed rail network across the east coast of Australia. And we're just going to switch slides here. So as Bala juggles the technology, I'm just going to briefly introduce it and hand to Reg to really go into the deep dive in the work that we've been doing. But we will stress it is a preliminary investigation, and what we've been looking at doing with this piece of work is trying to understand with value uplift and sort of thinking about transformational infrastructure like high-speed rail, other ways of what it might mean for those cities and regions that it goes through, and what are the potentially financial sort of uplift opportunities for understanding what value it might create across that infrastructure. And I guess high-speed rail might be back on the agenda. Anthony Albanese has announced earlier this year a commitment of 500 million for a fast train connection between Newcastle and Sydney. So there is a Labor commitment there. We know that John Alexander, parliamentarian, is very supportive of high-speed rail. And there's been a number of studies for many, many years looking at high-speed rail. We have a project that's been undertaken in partnership with Frontier SI and Commonwealth Bank of Australia and others called Value Australia, where we're starting to develop some techniques and some deep analytics to be able to do what Reg is going to walk through, what we've done quite manually for this study, but being able to rapidly be able to look at value uplift scenarios and changes in property prices. So I guess this is somewhat of a teaser into the digital toolkit that we're currently working on and finalising for release, and that will be subject to another presentation later on. And really what we wanted to do is provide an independent view and analysis of this high-speed rail across the east coast of Australia, and really see if we can stimulate debate in a timely sort of way, given we are coming up to a new federal election. So I'm going to hand over to Reg now, who's going to drive the rest of this.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you everybody for joining us this afternoon. It's been a little while since I've given one of these presentations thanks to COVID, so you might have to bear with me at a couple of points as I remember how to use the clicker and actually speak to people. So just to sort of give a bit of an overview of the project, fundamentally we were looking at producing estimates of land value uplift associated with the development of a high-speed rail corridor between Melbourne and Brisbane. There's a value capture perspective involved in this, but it wasn't necessarily the main focus of our report. We weren't doing a comparison between value capture mechanisms. We were mostly just looking at what that increase in value is going to be. And so the work that we did was done on a high level and preliminary basis. It's intended to sort of form a base for future work and sort of set out important considerations for people to look at now early on in the process, so that the whole thing doesn't necessarily get away from us. So first up, I'm just going to give a quick overview of the proposed HSR system that we've based our study off. So this is drawn from reports prepared for the Federal Infrastructure Department back in the Rudd-Gillard era. So this is taken from the Phase 2 report into high-speed rail in 2013. And you can see the map of the proposed line there that they've sort of used for their study. So it's got a total of 20 stations, four stations in the major cities of Sydney, Canberra, Brisbane and Melbourne, as well as city peripheral stops sort of on the edge of these cities to provide interchanges. And then 12 what we've called regional stops, which is also including the Gold Coast, which is sort of everything else in between. It's costed $114 billion in 2012 terms, which is, it's a big number, but it's a very long train line. And they're expecting stage construction over a period of 46 years. In terms of travel time, it's looking at 2 hours and 45 minutes maximum from Sydney to Melbourne and slightly less from Sydney to Brisbane. It's intended to be faster than air travel for most trips, so within the urban area, once you're taking into account the door-to-door travel time and transfers to and from the airport. And sort of outside of these intercity trips, it's also a dramatic shortening of all of the trips to regional locations. It's making the Central Coast and Southern Highlands stops within half an hour of Central, for example, or Newcastle within 40 minutes of Central. And then, all of the stops on this line will be within an hour and a half of a major city or thereabouts. Coffs Harbour will be about an hour and a half each from Brisbane and Sydney, and similarly for Wagga Wagga between Sydney and Melbourne. So when we were looking at this proposal, we kind of distilled it down to two sources of value uplift that we were going to look at. We've called these infrastructure-related value uplift and planning-related value uplift. So the infrastructure-related value uplift, what we're talking about there is the uplift to existing or new dwellings, which is coming from an improved accessibility, the ability to travel quickly between different locations. And with the planning-related value uplift, what we're talking about there is the uplift to land values that will result from granting additional development rights, whether that's an increase in density or the rezonings from, say, agricultural land to urban land. And so the first of these affects both existing and new properties, whereas the planning-related value uplift will only pertain to newly constructed dwellings or other land uses for that matter. So in terms of our approach of how we've tried to, estimate these, for the infrastructure-related value uplift, we conducted a review of high-speed rail literature from overseas to try and identify what sort of uplifts you would expect to see flowing to existing dwellings. We've tried to estimate the total market value of dwellings within the catchment areas around each of these stations, and then apply this increased value to sort of try and understand what that would look like in terms of a value increase from this improved accessibility. For the planning-related value uplift, what we've done is we've taken a residual land value approach, which is essentially looking at the market values of new dwellings that would be built, and then less the costs, and then using that to estimate what the value of the land would be under a construction scenario. And then to take that out of just looking at a per lot or per hectare basis, we prepared some population and dwelling growth assumptions to sort of say, what if in this scenario, if you had this much population growth, what would the value uplift be? So it's important to know that there is just a couple limitations to our scope, which are quite key, and they were sort of done for the purpose of reducing the complexity of the analysis at this preliminary stage. Obviously, there's further work to be done to address these in the future. And then primarily we were only considering the stops outside of the major cities. And then we're also only considering residential land uses. And it's important to note that in both of these cases, we're limiting the total value uplift that we'll be looking at. So the stuff that we've left out would represent an increase in value that we haven't quantified in all of our work. So it's going to lead to an underestimate, is sort of our feeling in that sense. So first of all, I'll talk you through how we've looked at our infrastructure-related value uplift. As I mentioned before, we did a review of the literature on what the sort of impacts on land values are once high-speed rail is introduced. It showed that there was mixed results in major cities, whereas for smaller cities and regional centres, they show a more consistent positive impact on land values, which is largely driven by the fact that these major cities have already got quite high levels of accessibility, so the impacts in those locations aren't as pronounced. Whereas the difference in accessibility once you start connecting regional centres to major cities is quite massive. So we identified a range of value uplifts between 10 and 14% as a result of this review. So we took the number of dwellings from the 2016 census by looking at various statistical areas and catchments around the proposed railway stations. We took median dwelling values from the Australian property monitors to give it a total estimate of current land value in the area, and then we applied one of three coefficients between 10, either 10, 12 or 14%, depending on the station location, which we'll see in just the next slide. So this table essentially shows the results of this analysis of infrastructure-related value uplift, which we've shown in the column on the far right. If we're looking at just the overall figure, it's $25 billion is what we've estimated this at. And that obviously varies between different stops. Excuse me 1 minute, I've just talked my mouth dry. And in the interest of keeping the presentation moving and having enough time at the end for questions, I'll try not to go too much into the details of this. There's, of course, more detail in our report, which is available online. We'll have a link at the end of this presentation. So just to talk about a couple of quick limitations in terms of the infrastructure-related value uplift analysis. We're using median house prices for detached dwellings in a lot of these locations, and particularly the Gold Coast. You'll have a lot of higher density built forms, such as apartments or townhouses, which will have lower sales values. So it's probably going to produce a bit of an overestimate using this, but because again, it's sort of we've used a few heuristics in our process to make sure that we can get this out in a timely fashion and sort of leave a bit more detail to future work. And the second limitation that we've identified here is that the value uplift coefficient is 10 to 14% increase. It's being transplanted from cities in Asia or regional centres in Asia, and there might be some issues in terms of transferring that to the Australian context. It's kind of hard to say because unfortunately nobody's built high-speed rail in Australia before for us to do comparative analysis on. So this next section is talking through the planning-related value uplift. This first slide is essentially just providing an overview of how a residual land value analysis would work. So the basic formula is your residual land value is the market value of new dwellings less all of your development costs, which is also inclusive of a profit margin for the developer based on their cost and risk. So essentially, you've got your revenues, and then from that you'll take away your various cost components, your marketing, your construction costs in terms of your materials and labour, all the way down to whatever you have left over is then what the developer is able to pay the current landholder to purchase their land and then complete the development. So in terms of what we've assumed for this analysis, again, we've sort of assumed a low density built form just to keep things a bit more simplistic. So looking at sort of a built form which would be comparable to what you're seeing developed on the urban fringes of Australia's major cities at the moment in terms of greenfield areas. There's some stats there in terms of our dwelling densities and sizes. This is a rather large table of our cost side assumptions. Again, I'm not going to go into detail on this. This is kind of to give you an overview of the sort of things that we are looking at. I will note there's a couple of things that are simplified here in the interest of, sort of keeping this simple for a preliminary analysis. But we're looking at things like you've got your professional fees in there, financing costs, and we're also looking at various indexes based on regional location, because you do see higher construction costs in certain regional locations further out of major cities. In terms of our assumptions for sales values for new dwellings, we've identified these through what we've called a substitution approach. And so essentially what we've done with that is if you were to say you have a location which is now going to become 60 minutes from Sydney, for example, such as Taree, we've looked at comparable areas which are 60 minutes from Sydney CBD per train, such as Fairfield, Blacktown and Liverpool, and then essentially evaluated what you're realising in terms of new dwelling values in these locations, and then said, okay, well, this is perhaps what we would expect to see in these other locations that are around the high-speed rail stops. In some cases that didn't work because half an hour out of Sydney by train, there's not a hell of a lot of new detached dwellings being built. So we have made some adjustments here that I won't go into details on in order to get assumptions for the whole set of stations. So again, apologies for a large set of tables. Primarily, so these are the results from the residual land value analysis. The first table on the left is kind of just talking about our assumed construction costs and realisation or sales values for each station location. And then the two tables on the right are our results, the middle one being on a per lot basis and the one on the right being on a per hectare basis. And the last column of each of those second two tables is essentially what we're estimating the land value uplift to be when you're switching from an agricultural use to this low density residential use. And as we can see looking over it, there's a bit of a range. Some of these locations are show quite a positive, quite a significant uplift in terms of switching uses from agricultural to urban land. This is largely linked to predominantly the better performing stops are the ones which were deriving sales values from Sydney. Just particularly given Sydney's property market is particularly hot. Not to say that it's not hot in other cities of Australia, but particularly pronounced in the analysis that we've done here. I'll try to avoid spending too much time on this. Again, there's more detail in the report, and we have time for questions at the end. So in terms of technical limitations, in terms of this RLD analysis, again, we've only considered detached dwellings. In reality, you would expect to see a mix of built forms being produced, some medium density, some high density, as well as non-residential land uses. We have simplified some development assumptions. We're also not taking into account the net present value method, which is what you'd expect developers to be working out their own feasibility with. And we're also only using current market values and construction costs, which might change relative to each other over time. For example, if construction costs grew at a higher rate than house prices, you'd expect that residual land value to go down and vice versa. So we're talking about that in terms of what would the value uplift be per dwelling or per hectare, and it's not really translated. It doesn't really give you a sense of the scale of what that might look like. So in interest of bringing it out of that just per dwelling thing, we produced these three what if, we're calling them population scenarios, which is just basically saying if you achieved X number of population growth, which will equate to X number of dwelling growth, this is what you would expect to see for the value uplift. To produce detailed forecasts and actual estimates of what we think the population growth would be is a very long process. You have to do land use planning around every stop, and it's definitely out of scope for this particular report. So these are our results. Once you're looking at the population scenarios, so just again, a large table. This seems to be a bit of a thing of mine. You can see that the first three columns is the population and the high, medium, and low scenarios, ranging from a high scenario of potentially 1.25 million people moving into stations, the areas around these stations, which represents a very aspirational sort of shift in the way that we plan, and it would involve a concerted effort across states to say we want to be settling people in the regions and away from cities. Sort of down to the lower estimate of about 250,000 people, which is much more modest. In terms of value uplift, what that translates to, the high scenario, it's again a large number, $115 billion or 57 billion for the medium scenario, and down to 23 billion for the value uplift in the low scenario. And so I will note that this is separate or exclusive to the infrastructure related value uplift that we identified. So it's an extra 25 billion on top of whatever number that you get out, which is obviously dependent on your population increase. So that would be up to 140 billion in the high scenario, or if we're just looking at the more modest low scenario, still close to $50 billion. By no means a paltry sum. So in terms of limitations of the population scenarios, as I've said before, they're deliberately rudimentary, and it's not been based on this long detailed analysis, which is something which would have to take place as part of the feasibility studies involved in planning for this line, if it were to be built. So as a result of everything that we've kind of looked at here, we've got 5 key considerations for policymakers. And it's sort of important that this stuff happens ahead of time. It happens now. So in terms of it's very important that the project details don't get announced ahead of any value capture mechanism that would be proposed. This is largely due to people then speculating on property increases, and it has the potential to erode a lot of this potential value capture that you can get if you implement a system after people have already started speculating and bidding up the price of land in these areas. Well, there are mechanisms to then sort of claw that back, depending on how you set up your value capture mechanism, but it becomes politically unpopular very quickly. Our second recommendation is that, it's going to require a lot of buy-in from the states. The division of powers means that the Commonwealth isn't actually going to be responsible for implementing any of these sort of planning regimes or the value capture mechanisms themselves. So it definitely needs to have good coordination and communication in that regard. The third recommendation is around, I guess, political sensitivities of implementation of value capture, which I'm kind of using as code for people being afraid of new taxes. We've all seen how the introduction of taxes has gone in a lot of cases in Sydney, so it's really important that governments communicate who would be paying for these value capture mechanisms and whether or not it's coming out of increases of value of existing landholders or being added on to the cost of new dwellings, which in reality it isn't. So number 4, our recommendation is that this detailed land use planning process that I was talking about to work out how many people would actually go around these stations, it's something that needs to be integrated very early on in the process of planning for this HSR network. It's a very significant, complicated piece of work and would again require buy-in from the states and also local governments along the line. And this 5th key consideration, this more speaks to the fact that the high-speed rail network presents an opportunity to proactively shape settlements in Australia. It sort of hasn't, on a scale it hasn't really been seen before in the Australian context. So it's important to, I think in this case, to have a national settlement strategy in this sense to say, all right, well, this is where we want people to go overall for all of Australia, as opposed to perhaps a more piecemeal approach, which has existed in the past. Yeah, so just giving some acknowledgements. A big thank you to Professor Rob Freestone and James Abbott for reviewing the work. And yeah, a big thank you to the Value Australia Project who have funded the scheme. And at the bottom here, we have a link to our report if you would like to open it up and take a more detailed read. And I guess now we have time for questions.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Reg and Chris. That was a fantastic presentation. There are hands up already, so I will throw to David for the first question.
Oh, thank you very much. My name's David Wilmoth. My question relates to the relationship between the work you've done on value uplift and longer term regional development. And the context of this is that in the 1980s, it was my job to bring the 4 governments involved in the very fast train into a common decision-making and planning and environmental standards framework. And the project was derailed at the end, in part because Victoria broke the agreement on the route. And they did so around the question of value upgrade largely, where they chose a coastal route on the grounds that the very long-term impacts and the indirect impacts of the coastal route through Victoria were better than the more immediate and more quantifiable value uplift impacts on the inland route. And so my question really is, how would you extend this towards those more broad regional development issues? Might it not be, as it was the case in the VFT, that in some views like Mel Logan's, that the longer term regional development benefits of this project by having were consistent with having lower value uplift on the route? And so that's my question. Is it a matter of extending the methodology or finding a smart way to embed it into the more settlement development questions that will obviously go with this? It opens up a broad area of discussion, but it's very important.
Yeah, it is certainly very important, and thank you for the question. It really highlights the importance of considering this very early on in the process. I mean, our approach here, we've been looking, I guess, retrospectively on a high-speed rail line that was proposed in 2013. But I guess our strong recommendation would be that for any alternative routes that are even being considered, that you would conduct a similar analysis. And then in those cases, it would basically boil down to, I guess, the priorities of the government at the time around whether or not that longer term regional development benefits that could be realised are more important than being able to capture a higher amount of value. And certainly by no means should they be pursuing the highest amount of value capture. It's extremely important to be looking at the regional benefits. But yeah, ultimately it would have to be a decision that is contextually made, but with a view to being able to understand what the value capture would be. And then, yeah, I guess like a cost benefit being done on that. Chris, would you like to add anything?
So I'll just add to David, because I guess this is a preliminary investigation where we've only just taken the existing reports where, I mean, this methodology we hope would then be applied. It would need to be, as one of our recommendations, sort of embedded within a national settlement agenda and proper planning and looking at all considerations. And as Reg was showing, there's a lot of sensitivity just in the population growth that will drive, you know, whether in our low scenario on the what if, then we're looking at 23 billion as opposed to 115 billion. So I think there's also the accessibility and the connectivity component, you know, which was still considerable, that infrastructure accessibility uplift, which was around 25 billion. But I think really you need to be able to look for a lot more what if. So we're not saying that this should be the final. That was not the purpose of our report, was to say this is where it should go. We were just taking, if we were to look at this sort of approach, you know, we haven't done the modelling. If you were to change the routes, we've been working on a toolkit that you can then drag and drop new stations, and it will tell you, and you can calculate quite quickly what those different scenarios might be. But yeah, I think that would need to be, you know, fully considered. What are the final stops? Sure. We're just really trying to illustrate that if you took that, for example, as a network, there's huge amounts of potential value uplift that could then go towards the infrastructure. And also we hope other schemes around housing affordability and making those areas more livable, equitable, resilient places to live. Sure.
I was just thinking that you might give some thought to the methodology, not to do a broader study, but to show the ways in which this embedding can actually extend your methodology around value capture through different means and instruments and over different timescales. You know, not to do the work, just to show how the embedding can be more rigorous than just throwing it to the political lines.
Good point. Thanks, David.
Thanks, David. Our next question's from Kerry.
Thanks very much, and thanks, Reg, for the presentation. What fun to be playing with train sets. Excellent stuff. A couple of things just with my developer background, just that you might like to ponder. The taking of relative worth from Sydney and planting that in a regional location is, I think, something that needs careful thought. Certainly it's not the way that the market or the development industry would think of product pricing. There's a relativity for new land or new house product which relates to the existing house product within a place. And that isn't going to, well, it's got a very complex interaction with infrastructure delivery, even a transformative infrastructure delivery like rail. More particularly, some things to ponder are, would a developer want the same development margin in a regional location? And typically the margin the developer wants reflects risk, and the risk in a regional location is significantly higher than in a larger metropolis. And that will drive some considerable change in those numbers. And the input development costs in the various places will vary. Part of the driver for the value of product at the fringe is the cost of the inputs of developer contributions, water and sewer charges and the like, which are going to be significantly lesser in a rural location. So there's a couple of things, perhaps they might offset one another to some degree, but if I can posit, it's just not as simple as picking up a value an hour from Sydney and translating it to an hour from Port Macquarie.
Yeah, certainly not. Some very, very excellent valid points you've raised there. I guess sort of, first of all, when we were, I mean, we have by necessity simplified this, given that it's sort of at a very preliminary stage. So I've, you know, the methods and assumptions used are definitely not my first choice for doing a full detailed analysis. The substitution approach that we used in terms of taking land values from one location just purely based on distance, yeah, again, definitely wouldn't have been my first choice, but in terms of the expediency of what we have available to us now, it was just part of the Value Australia project. We're working on developing further tools that would be better placed to understand the impacts of just this the change in accessibility in terms of the introduction of a new rail line, all other things staying the same, which should hopefully try and address some of these the downfalls of just transplanting a single the house price from one location to another. Unfortunately, they're not fully developed at this point. And I guess we kind of wanted to really start getting the conversation looking at the value uplift quite early on in the piece, because it is possible to lose ground on this quite rapidly if the planning process for the high-speed rail moves ahead without it. So it is definitely something that was on my mind. And yeah, we kind of had to do the best with what we had at this point in time.
Very good points, Kerry. And also, look, this is somewhat connected to Reg's PhD, and he's finished his first year, so he does have a couple of years to go. But very good feedback that he can take on board for his PhD and the other work we're doing in the project. So thanks for that feedback, Kerry.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. There's no other hands up, so I'm gonna I guess reflect on some of your conclusions and see whether I can get you to talk a little bit more around them, Reg and Chris. So I thought on your previous slide, it was excellent that you made the point that the announcement of the project details shouldn't occur ahead of the fully developed case, because otherwise you're going to lose your potential for value capture. You also mentioned, though, that doing this is going to require cooperation between the states, and there's going to be a lot of people involved in all of those types of negotiations that David was talking about what's the best route and what's in the best interests of each state. And I guess reflecting on those two things, I'm interested in your own opinions about how you could best use models like this to help have those conversations, but to have them in a way where you don't let the cat out of the bag too early and lose the value uplift benefit. I don't know the answer, but I'm thinking you probably thought about it a bit more than I have. So back to you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment there, Hazel. I guess certainly the intention of having these tools set up, and I mean, again, as we said, this was a preliminary thing. Once we get a bit more advanced with the work that I'm doing my PhD in the Australia project, the intention of these tools is to, I guess, really support a collaborative decision-making process. It's going to be an incredibly complex task, getting buy-in from various different governments and balancing the interests of various different regions. And so the idea is that if people sitting in a room and they wanted to be able to say, well, what happens if we move the line over here and then start putting these new stops in this other location, that there is the analytical infrastructure there for them to be able to analyze that extremely quickly. So it's essentially cutting down the time that it would take to conduct this sort of analysis, and sort of thing, which would bring it more towards a point where people can actually collaborate quite rapidly and then understand the implications of what changed route would mean in terms of value capture, in comparison to sort of just say the regional development thing. Chris is popping up, as well.
Yeah, good question, Hazel, because I think there's a whole piece here that we haven't discussed about, that we only touch upon, is around the whole governance, the open governance framework that would need to be operationalized to then make sure that creators value and the sort of issues that David was talking about were addressed, and that's a very complex, important piece that is required. We can do modelling, and there's you can do the modelling, run advanced machine learning and statistical analyses on big data and all of this, but if it's not tied into a really rigorous, robust and well supported urban governance process and planning process, then you'll get limited traction. I mean, we know all the time in government, across government, there's, things can be worked on methodically, confidentially to start with, and bringing the right players in. Those mechanisms are in place if needed. And we've had groups and smaller projects come into the City Analytics Lab and these sorts of facilities to sort of, I guess, brainstorm what various solutions could or should be and how they could be implemented. But I think it comes back to, the national settlement planning agenda that's embraced by the federal government in partnership with the states and territories. And really, ideally, it would see that sort of operationalized and implemented in order to then, make this sort of modeling and analytics a reality.
Great, thanks, Chris. We've got another question from Peter.
Thanks, Hazel. Hi, Reg and Chris. Thanks for the presentation. Yeah, I enjoyed it. I suppose following on from Hazel's comments, can you see this as, well, the first step being the Albanese plan to promote high-speed rail between Sydney and Newcastle, or the Hunter, as being the micro version of this, and then you sort of can tread the water, if you like, test the water to see the ramifications of the broader network?
So, I mean, look, yes, I guess you could. And like Reg was saying before, there hasn't been any studies here to study any implementations of high-speed rail. I mean, it's the holy grail as you'd implement the whole thing, in one fell swoop. But realistically, I guess the main goal is to get high-speed rail built, at least for those who think that it's a good thing, which, we've done the study, at least I can say, I think it has merit if it's done properly. But yeah, being able to then look at one particular study or tranche of that, and then look at the lessons learnt and study that, and then take it forward. Reg, did you?
Yeah, certainly, and it's just given the scale of the project, it will necessarily need to be delivered in stages. Like the original report we were looking at anticipated that as well. I mean, they didn't necessarily think of the Sydney to Newcastle thing first. They were Sydney to Canberra and then Canberra to Melbourne in terms of their staging. Although definitely there's a lot of merit in looking at the Sydney to Newcastle bit first as well. But it's, in saying that, it's very important that you do review the whole picture of it from the outset. It's not just let's build it to Newcastle and then we'll think about every other stop along the route. It's very important that they do consider the value propositions for the entire project up front, and then continually review as each section is built.
Okay, thanks.
Sorry, you go.
Can I make a point? I'm not sure whether Hazel can see me or hear me, but do tell me if this is total fantasy, but isn't the key to the avoidance of losing the value uplift because speculation takes place before, in expectation that there's going to be a line along this route? Isn't the key to avoiding that government making it clear that or giving itself the power to compulsorily purchase the land afterwards, after the announcement, at the agricultural value? If people have bought it for a lot more, fine, but they're taking a risk because that won't be beneficial in the long run if they've pushed the value up to the point that they've paid way too much for the land and they've eroded the benefit that should have been gained for the public as a whole through value capture.
Certainly, and it's a very important consideration, Hal, thanks for that. My understanding of the compulsory acquisition system in New South Wales, which I have to throw back in my mind to the undergraduate degree here at UNSW, is that the government would still have power to acquire the land at the agricultural values, even if somebody has paid over the odds for that. In terms of the actual mechanism, whether or not that actually is what pans out, I'm not familiar with the sort of operational aspects of that. It might be a bit trickier in practice than it is sort of specifically in the letter of the law. And it's probably important to reflect that that's more relevant for the actual infrastructure itself, like the purchase of the corridor and the stations and the sort of surrounding land needed for construction. Whereas the speculative getting up can massively affect stuff which would not be compulsorily acquired by the government. I mean, you know, they could compulsorily acquire the land theoretically and try and develop some houses, but it's, you know, it's something you'd expect to see maybe in Hong Kong rather than Australia. So yeah, it is important, but like ultimately, I think just, the communication, as you brought up, is hugely important. If they can communicate early on that there will be value capture, if they can communicate that it's going to be significant.
Well, at least people have to think it's a risk.
Yeah.
And it isn't only Singapore. I mean, the Netherlands and Germany, government acquires land at agricultural values, puts in the infrastructure, develops it, and then sells the product at a land value reflecting that.
I mean, I think it's a good idea. Whether or not it'd be realisable politically is a
well, it's maybe thinking the unthinkable, but you know, with a you know, project like this, we're doing it anyway.
Certainly. Any more questions?
Thanks, Hal. There was a hand up before. Perhaps it was Todd, if you wanted to ask a question.
Yes, thanks. I just wanted to ask whether, I guess, the experience of regional communities of, you know, increasing house prices during the pandemic and the dislocation that's caused in some instances is kind of a factor that is considered in this analysis of whether or not value uplift is a positive thing in regional locations.
Thanks for that question. It's very, very good point. No, it's not something we've considered, is the short answer. We've sort of tried to take a value ambivalent approach, or sort of we're not trying to apply value judgments on what the value uplift here. It's definitely something which would need to form part of any socioeconomic impact assessment of this infrastructure, and you know, it extends beyond just the value uplift being a potentially negative thing on certain communities through to you know, potential shifts of growth to areas around the high-speed rail stations. For example, it's the areas between the stations might not see as much economic development as they would have seen otherwise. There's a whole range of complex social issues and economic issues that need to be addressed here. It's something that we shied away from in this case, but it's definitely something that as planners we would 100% say needs to be evaluated as part of the planning for this infrastructure.
I mean, yeah, it's an interesting point. We've got other colleagues in the centre, like Bill Randolph and Will, are doing some work looking at what, and others with the Huri project, I think, with Laura Cromlin, looking at work, you know, what does it mean in regional New South Wales, you know, with what's happening with people moving to the regions and vacancy rates, you know, getting down to 1% or so. And I guess, you know, forget fast rail, but there's obviously an impact on regional communities that's happening with, you know, property price increases going up 20, 30% in some areas. And what is that doing on current infrastructure too? People are moving to areas, obviously Byron Bay is one that's talked about, but there's many others across the country where, you know, post-COVID, what is this going to mean for regions, and in the long term too, where people are moving further out? What does that mean for schools? What does it mean for hospitals and other infrastructure? So yeah, there's lots there that needs to be unpacked.
I guess so.
Speaking of Will, just to interrupt you, he's got his hand up. So Will, do you want to contribute to this conversation?
Hey guys, great presentation, Chris and Reg. Nice to see you again. I was just wondering a question around sequencing, because, you know, we were bringing up the idea of what sort of section of the rail gets built at what time, and obviously the sequencing of when they announce this is very important because you got to capture the value before it goes up. So I was wondering if you guys have any thoughts about, you know, with those different sections of the rail being built at different times, when the value capture policy would be would it be implemented differentially for each different sort of section of the line? And I mean that we might not have an answer to that yet, but I'm just wondering if there's any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, we certainly don't have an answer to that at this point with the work that we've done. It's largely dependent on what method or what mechanism you would use to try and capture the value. I guess the timing of it, if you're looking at betterment levies, it's probably going to be implemented sort of around about the time of construction or ahead of it, or if you follow the IA recommendation for a broad-based land tax, it's something which rolls in over time and theoretically gets capitalised into house prices, according to some people, although that's slightly dubious. Yeah, it's definitely something which would need to be forming part of the broader look at value capture as part of this in terms of the planning for the new line.
And I guess various states and territories have various mechanisms already, and there's no consistent approaches too. So I guess there's a previous Grattan Institute report done a few years ago that had some interesting things to say about value uplift. But I guess one point I possibly would agree on that report was around trying to come up, if we can, with a consistent approach. Because if you're going to implement this across states and territories, and then, that then links into, somewhat to what you're saying about sequencing, and also equity and the equitable distribution and approaches for that value uplift.
Very big question of fairness there.
Yeah, sorry, it was a tricky one to answer, but.
Well, Will, I should throw it back to you as a co-author on the report.
I know.
Do you have views on it?
I don't have any answers. I'm asking the questions.
All right. Well, we're a few minutes from the end of our session, and I think that has been an absolutely fantastic presentation, followed by a really interesting conversation. So thank you for that, our presenters and our audience. Thanks for joining us for our first seminar of 2022. And we hope that you will join us again for future seminars that'll be running throughout the year. So keep an eye out for those. And yeah, please join me in thanking our presenters today.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you for the great questions, guys.
Happy Friday, everyone.